June 4th, 1942, 14,000 feet above the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander John Thach is leading a division of just 4F Wildcats directly into a swarm of 20 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. By every metric in the U.S. Navy flight manual, Thach is already a dead man. The math is absolute. The Zero climbs faster, flies faster, and can turn inside the Wildcat's radius by a margin of 40%. In a dogfight, that 40% is the difference between a funeral and a victory roll. Standard doctrine was simple, run. But as the Japanese tracers start tearing past his canopy, Thach doesn't run. He does something that violates every rule of air combat. He turns his nose away from the enemy and flies directly at his own wingman. It looked like panic. It looked like a mid-air collision in the making. But to understand how this suicidal maneuver became the deadliest trap in the Pacific, we have to go back to a kitchen table in San Diego. 3 months before the trap at Midway was sprung, the mood at Naval Air Station San Diego was suffocating. It was early 1942, and the Pacific Fleet was still pulling bodies out of the oil-slicked waters of Pearl Harbor. But for the fighter pilots of Fighting Squadron 3, the real horror wasn't what had happened on the ground. It was what was happening in the air. Intelligence reports were filtering back from the Coral Sea and the Philippines, and they all told the same terrifying story. The Imperial Japanese Navy wasn't just winning, they were flying an aircraft that defied the laws of physics. They called it the Type 0 carrier fighter, the Zero. For the American pilots trained on the heavy industrial logic of Western engineering, the Zero was a ghost. It was fast, it possessed an impossible range of over 1,000 miles, and most lethally, it could dance. A Japanese pilot could pull his stick back and execute a turn so tight it would black out an American aviator just trying to follow him. Facing this ghost was the Grumman F4F Wildcat. If the Zero was a samurai sword, sharp, agile, and fragile, the Wildcat was a sledgehammer. Built by the Grumman Iron Works. It was a stubborn, barrel-chested machine. It had self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy armor plating behind the pilot, and a rugged structure that could absorb punishment that would disintegrate a Japanese plane. But in a dogfight, durability is a consolation prize for the loser. The disparity came down to a brutal equation of aerodynamics known as wing loading. Imagine the total weight of the aircraft divided by the surface area of its wings. The Zero was constructed from a special, ultralight aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin. To save weight, the Japanese engineers stripped away everything. No armor for the pilot, no self-sealing tanks, no heavy framing. The result was a featherweight fighter with massive wings. It had incredibly low wing loading, meaning it could float through the air and pivot on a dime. The Wildcat was the opposite. It was heavy. It had short, stubby, square-tipped wings. Its high wing loading meant that when an American pilot banked hard, the wings struggled to generate enough lift to pull the heavy fuselage around the corner. The plane would shudder, buffet, and slide wide. The math dictated the outcome of every engagement before the engines even started. If a Wildcat pilot tried to turn with a Zero, the Japanese fighter would simply cut across the inside of the circle. Within 14 seconds, less time than it takes to check your fuel gauges, the Zero would be directly behind the Wildcat, slotted into the kill position at 6 o'clock. This technical mismatch birthed a psychological sickness in the fleet. It was the Zero myth. Rookie pilots were convinced the Japanese plane was invincible. Combat reports were filled with the desperate scribblings of survivors who had watched their wingmen try to dogfight, only to be chewed up by 20mm cannon fire. The official response from the Navy brass did nothing to stop the bleeding. The tactical manuals, written by men who had flown biplanes in 1918, offered advice that sounded like a death sentence to the men in the cockpit. The doctrine was rigid. Do not dogfight. Maintain altitude advantage. Dive, fire, and run. Hit and run. It sounded prudent on paper. But Lieutenant Commander John Thach, commanding officer of VF-3, wasn't flying paper. He was flying defense for a slow-moving aircraft carrier. If Japanese bombers were diving on the USS Lexington or the Yorktown, Thach couldn't hit and run. He had to stay. He had to hold the line. Running meant abandoning the fleet to destruction. Thach sat in his quarters, surrounded by after-action reports that read like obituaries. He respected the Zero, but he refused to worship it. He looked past the myth and saw the engineering trade-off. The Zero had a fatal flaw. Its light construction meant it was a tinderbox. A few good hits from the Wildcats, 50 caliber machine guns, would turn a Zero into a fireball. The problem was geometry. You couldn't shoot what you couldn't catch, and you couldn't catch what could turn inside your own shadow. The Navy's solution was superior piloting. Just fly better. Thach knew that was a lie. You cannot outfly physics. If he sent his boys up against the Zeros using standard one-on-one tactics, he was sending them to the slaughter. He needed a way to negate the turn. He needed to create a situation where the Wildcats' inability to turn didn't matter. He needed to rewrite the geometry of the kill. And since the Navy manual didn't have the answer, John Thach grabbed a pack of matches and cleared off his kitchen table. On that wooden table, the matches weren't just timber and phosphorus. They were vectors. Thach placed one matchstick representing a Wildcat and another representing a Zero. He pushed them through the standard maneuvers of the day, the loop, the barrel roll, the Immelmann. Every time he simulated a turn, the result was the same. The Zero matchstick, with its superior lift and tighter radius, inevitably ended up behind the Wildcat. Bang. Dead. He tried climbing. The Zero climbed faster. Dead. He tried diving. The Zero followed, lighter and faster. Dead. The physics were a prison, and for the American pilot, there was no parole. Thach realized he was trying to solve the wrong variable. He couldn't change the turn radius of the Wildcat. Grumman had built the tank they built. He couldn't change the skill of the Japanese veterans. But there was one variable nobody was looking at: the number of aircraft working as a single organism. He reached into the box and pulled out a second matchstick. He placed it parallel to the first Wildcat. Now he had a section leader and a wingman. Standard Navy doctrine of 1942 said that in combat, a pair should fly a loose deuce, splitting up to attack or covering each other from a distance. But Thach pushed the two matches closer together, imagining an invisible, rigid tether connecting them. He moved the Zero match behind the first Wildcat. The Predator had taken the bait. In a standard fight, that Wildcat pilot would brake hard right or left, trying to shake the bogey, effectively isolating himself and exposing his tail. But Thach moved the matchstick differently. Instead of breaking away to run, the baited Wildcat turned inward, cutting across the sky towards his wingman. Simultaneously, the wingman match turned inward as well. The two Wildcats flew a collision course, crossing paths like the closing blades of a pair of scissors. Thach stared at the pattern on the table. It was simple geometry, but the tactical implications were violent. As the two Wildcats crossed, the Zero stuck on the tail of the first plane would be forced to follow it through the turn. By doing so, the Japanese pilot, fixated on his kill, would fly directly across the nose of the second Wildcat. It wasn't a dogfight anymore. It was a firing squad. The second Wildcat wouldn't have to engage in a turning contest. He would just have to pull the trigger. The Zero's greatest strength, its aggression and ability to stick to a target's tail, would be used to pull it into a wall of 50 caliber lead. Thach called it the beam defense position. The idea was that each plane would constantly scan the beam, the vulnerable side area of his partner. If one was attacked, they would scissor, swapping places and clearing each other's tails. But matchsticks don't fly at 300 miles per hour, and they don't carry high explosive ammunition. Thach knew that on paper, this looked like genius. In the air, it looked like a mid-air collision. He needed to know if this geometric theory could survive the chaos of real flight. He needed a pilot who could fly with surgical precision, someone who wouldn't flinch at the idea of flying head-on at a closure rate of 600 knots. He found Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare. O'Hare was a pugnacious, barrel-chested aviator who flew the Wildcat like he was born in the cockpit. He was already gaining a reputation as a natural marksman, a man who understood the machine better than the engineers who built it. Thach called him into his quarters and laid out the matches again. He explained the weave. He explained the scissoring motion. He explained that for this to work, they had to ignore every survival instinct that told them to create separation. O'Hare looked at the diagram. He looked at Thach. He didn't ask about the aerodynamics or the risk. He just asked, "When do we test it?" They took two Wildcats up over the desert east of San Diego, far away from the prying eyes of the base commanders. Thach didn't want the brass to see this yet. He didn't want to explain why he was burning precious aviation fuel, practicing a maneuver that wasn't in the manual. Up at 10,000 feet, They ran the simulation. Thach played the bait. He keyed the mic. Break. Both planes banked hard toward each other. The horizon tilted. The distance between them collapsed instantly. The instinct to pull away, to flinch, was overwhelming. If either pilot miscalculated by a fraction of a second, or if one lost sight of the other in the sun, they wouldn't need a zero to kill them. They'd turn themselves into flying shrapnel. But they didn't flinch. They crossed with vertical separation, passing so close they could practically count the rivets on each other's cowlings. Thach looked back over his shoulder. If a zero had been on his tail, O'Hare would have had a perfect, non-deflection shot right into the enemy's engine block. They ran it again. And again. They practiced until the fear of collision was replaced by the rhythm of the weave. They realized the beauty of the trap was that it was perpetual. If the zero survived the first pass and stayed on the tail, the Wildcats simply reversed the turn and crossed again. A figure 8 pattern, a meat grinder that churned endlessly until the enemy was dead or out of ammo. Thach landed that afternoon with a strange sensation. For the first time since the war began, he didn't feel like he was piloting a victim. He had found the equalizer. He had engineered a way to make the inferior Wildcat lethal. But as he taxied in, the euphoria faded. He realized that proving it to Butch O'Hare was the easy part. Now, he had to convince the United States Navy to throw away 20 years of doctrine and let his pilots fly head-on at each other in the middle of a war zone. But in 1942, the U.S. Navy's tactical doctrine wasn't just a book, it was a religion, and John Thach was preaching heresy. For 2 decades, American naval aviation had been built on the altar of the Lufbery Circle, named after the World War I ace Raoul Lufbery. This formation was the standard defensive posture for outnumbered squadrons. It was simple. When under attack, American pilots would form a tight, continuous ring, flying in a circle. Each plane protected the tail of the man in front of him. It was a wagon train in the sky, a static, defensive fortress designed to wait out the enemy. But Thach knew that against the zero, the Lufbery Circle was nothing more than a convenient buffet for Japanese gunners. The Zero didn't play by World War I rules. It could dive from altitude, slash through the circle, and zoom back up before a Wildcat could even lift its nose. The circle was passive. It ceded the initiative. It was a formation that said, "We are afraid to fight." When Thach presented his beam defense concept to the senior leadership, the room didn't erupt in applause. It fell into a confused silence. He was proposing that pilots voluntarily break formation, expose their bellies to the enemy, and fly collision courses with their own wingmen. To a commander raised on the rigid discipline of formation flying, where maintaining distance was the first commandment of safety, Thach weaving looked like aerial suicide. Critics pointed out the obvious. You're asking panicked combat pilots, under fire, to fly head-on at a closure rate of 600 miles per hour. They argued that in the chaos of a dogfight, the weave would result in more dead Americans from mid-air collisions than from Japanese bullets. The consensus was clear. Stick to the manual. Stick to the circle. Thach realized he wasn't going to win this argument in a briefing room. He stopped asking for permission and started building a cult of survival within Fighting Squadron 3. On the flight deck of the USS Yorktown, amidst the smell of high-octane fuel and the roar of radial engines, Thach and O'Hare began a quiet revolution. They pulled pilots aside one by one. Ensign Dip Dipkaus, Ensign Daniel Sheedy, Lieutenant Yigtom Cheek. They used hands, matchsticks, and chalk diagrams on the ready room floor to deprogram the men from years of fight-alone training. The hardest part wasn't the flying. It was the trust. The weave required a pilot to suppress his survival instinct. When a zero latched onto your tail, every nerve ending in your body screamed to pull away, to jink, to run. Thach was asking them to do the opposite, to turn toward the help. He drilled into them that their life didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to their wingman. If you run, you die alone, Thach told them. If you weave, you live together. They practiced whenever they could, turning routine patrols into clandestine training sessions. They refined the timing. They learned to judge the scissoring point, the terrifying moment where 2 Wildcats cross paths with feet to spare. They learned that the maneuver had to be fluid, a constant motion of banking and reversing, like a pendulum. But time was running out. While Thach was trying to rewire his squadron's instincts, the Japanese Imperial Navy was assembling the largest armada in the history of the Pacific. In late May 1942, Naval intelligence at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor intercepted the message everyone had been dreading. The target was AF, Midway Island. Admiral Yamamoto was bringing everything he had: 4 heavy aircraft carriers, hundreds of support ships, and the cream of the Japanese naval air arm. The Yorktown, battered from the Coral Sea and patched together with plywood and prayer, sailed to meet them. Thach's squadron was on board. They were exhausted, outnumbered, and flying an inferior aircraft. The Navy manual said they were doomed. The statistics said they were dead men walking. On the morning of June 4th, the loudspeaker on the Yorktown crackled to life. "Pilots, man your planes." Thach climbed into his Wildcat, number 23. He strapped in, checked his magneto switches, and looked over at the Wildcats beside him. There was no more time for chalkboard diagrams. The training wheels were off. The beam defense was about to undergo the only test that mattered, a live fire trial against the most experienced killer in the sky. As the radial engine coughed to life and the propeller blurred into a disk of steel, Thach knew that in less than an hour, he would either be a genius who saved his men, or the fool who led them into a mid-air collision. He pushed the throttle forward, and VF-3 roared off the deck, climbing toward the inevitable. At 14,000 feet, the air was thin, cold, and deceptively empty. Thach leveled off his division of 4 Wildcats, his eyes scanning the blinding blue ceiling of the Pacific sky. Below them, the tragedy of the Battle of Midway was already unfolding. The slow, lumbering TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were making their run at the Japanese fleet, and they were being slaughtered. Thach's job was to keep the vultures off their backs. Then, the vultures arrived. They didn't appear as individual aircraft, but as a cascading waterfall of silver flakes dropping from the sun. 15, maybe 20 Zeros from the carrier Soryu, diving with the terrifying speed that had made them the masters of the Pacific. The Japanese flight leader, likely Lieutenant Masaharu Suganami, saw exactly what he expected to see. 4 clumsy American fighters, heavily outnumbered, flying in a loose line. To the Japanese veterans, this was a textbook meatball run. They held the altitude advantage, they held the speed advantage, and they knew the Americans would panic. They expected the Wildcats to scatter, to break formation in a desperate attempt to run for the deck, where the Zeros would pick them off one by one like wolves culling a herd. Suganami's pilots split their formation. One group stayed high to cut off any retreat, while the lead element rolled inverted and dove for the kill, their engines screaming as they built up kinetic energy. They selected the trailing Wildcat, flown by Ensign Daniel Sheedy, and closed the distance in seconds. Inside Sheedy's cockpit, the world dissolved into a cacophony of terror. Tracers whipped past his canopy bright streaks of magnesium that signaled the arrival of 20mm cannon shells. In any other battle, in any other month of the war, Sheedy would have done the human thing. He would have yanked the stick hard right, away from the fire, trying to escape the stream of lead. But Sheedy didn't turn away. He looked for John Thach. Thach saw the tracers. He saw the Zeros latching onto Sheedy's tail, locking into the 6 o'clock position for the execution shot. The geometry was set. The trap was primed. Thach keyed his throat microphone, his voice cutting through the static with a calm that sounded insane amidst the chaos. "Skipper to dip. Beam defense. Go." Thach slammed his stick to the right. His wingman, Ensign Ram Dipkaus, slammed his to the left. Simultaneously, Sheedy and Lieutenant Yig, Tom Cheek, executed the same mirror image violence. From the cockpit of the attacking Zero, the American maneuver looked like madness. The Japanese pilot, finger tightening on the cannon trigger, watched in confusion as his target didn't run away, but turned inward, banking hard to fly directly at the other American fighter. It defied all logic. It looked like the Americans were blinded by panic, steering their heavy Grumman fighters into a head-on collision. The Japanese pilot did exactly what Thach knew he would do. He got greedy. He ignored the other Wildcat approaching from the side and stayed fixated on the target in his gun sight. He pulled back on his stick, banking hard to follow Sheedy through the turn, intent on keeping his nose pointed at the Wildcat's tail. He was focused entirely on the lead, calculating where Sheedy would be in 2 seconds. He never saw the other variable. By committing to the turn, the Zero pilot had flown himself into a geometric kill box. He was now flying a curved path that intersected perfectly with the flight path of John Thach. He had unknowingly exposed his beam, the broad, vulnerable side of his fuselage, to a Wildcat approaching from the opposite direction. The closure rate was blinding. The two Wildcats, Thach and Sheedy, raced toward each other at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. The gap shrank from a mile, to 1,000 yards, to 500. It was a game of chicken, played with high explosives. Thach held his nerve. He watched the Zero chasing Sheedy drift into his windshield. The Japanese pilot was still looking at Sheedy, completely blind to the threat rushing in from his flank. He was a hunter who had forgotten he could be hunted. Thach didn't have to pull a high G turn. He didn't have to wrestle the heavy Wildcat against the laws of physics. He simply leveled his wings, led the target by 50 yards, and waited for the Zero to fly into his crosshairs. The trap snapped shut. At a range of 300 yards, Lieutenant Commander Thach squeezed the trigger. The 4 Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns mounted in his wings erupted, sending a converging stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds tearing through the space just ahead of the Zero's nose. This was the essence of deflection shooting. In a standard tail chase, a pilot has to constantly adjust his aim to account for the enemy's erratic movements, firing at a small, weaving target. But Thach wasn't chasing. He was intercepting. He was painting a wall of lead across the Zero's flight path. The Japanese pilot, locked in his high G turn, had no time to react. He flew his aircraft directly into the stream. The result was catastrophic physics. The combined closing speed meant the bullets didn't just penetrate, they shattered. The heavy, 50 caliber rounds smashed through the Zero's unarmored engine cowling and shredded the cockpit. The Japanese fighter, built for speed but not for survival, disintegrated. The fuel tanks, lacking the self-sealing rubber bladders of the American planes, ignited instantly. A fireball bloomed in the blue sky, marking the end of the invincible Zero. Thach didn't celebrate. He immediately reversed his turn, banking hard back towards Dipkhouse to reset the weave. Below him, Ensign Sheedy the Bait was still alive. The maneuver had worked exactly as the matchsticks had predicted on that kitchen table. By the time the smoke cleared, Thach had splashed 3 Zeros. His wingmen had damaged several others. But the most important statistic wasn't the kill count. It was the survival rate. Against a superior enemy force, flying superior aircraft, utilizing the element of surprise, Fighting Squadron 3 had held the line. The Japanese pilots were stunned. For 6 months, they had been the apex predators, accustomed to American pilots who ran or died in futile turning fights. Now, they were facing a machine that fought like a Hydra attack, one head, and another strikes you from the side. The Zeros broke off the attack, scattering in confusion, unable to solve the geometric puzzle Thach had presented to them. As Thach guided his battered division back toward the Yorktown, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, hard realization. The weave wasn't just a desperate trick for a single battle. It was a system. It was a replicable, teachable doctrine that stripped the Zero of its greatest advantage. The days of the lone samurai were over. The era of the wolf pack had begun. And as the Yorktown burned below them, eventually succumbing to Japanese torpedoes, Thach knew that while they might have lost the carrier, they had found the key to winning the war. He had proven that you didn't need a better plane to win, you just needed a better mind. That better mind didn't just save 4 pilots. It fundamentally altered the DNA of naval aviation, transforming the American fighter pilot from a lone duelist into a component of a lethal, interlocking machine. News of the engagement at Midway traveled through the fleet with the speed of a shockwave. For the first time, the Zero myth had been punctured, not by a new engine or a secret weapon, but by a tactical algorithm. The skepticism that had walled Thach off from the brass evaporated overnight. The beam defense was no longer a theory scribbled on a napkin. It was the only thing keeping Wildcat pilots alive. Among the first to grasp the magnitude of this shift was Lieutenant Commander James Jimmy Flatley, the skipper of VF-10, the Grim Reapers. Flatley was a pragmatist who saw the Pacific War for what it was, a meat grinder that would consume anyone foolish enough to play fair. He took Thach's concept and evangelized it across the Solomon Islands. It was Flatley who looked at the scissoring motion of the Wildcats and gave it the name that would enter the history books. He didn't call it the beam defense. He called it the Thach Weave. The timing could not have been more critical. The months following Midway were defined by the brutal, muddy attrition of Guadalcanal. This was the Cactus Air Force, a patchwork collection of Marine and Navy aviators flying from a cratered runway at Henderson Field. They were facing the elite of the Japanese Imperial Navy veterans like Saburo Sakai, men with thousands of flight hours who treated aerial combat as a sacred martial art. Without the Weave, the Cactus Air Force would have been annihilated. The Japanese pilots continued to fly with individual brilliance, relying on their own reflexes and the supernatural agility of the Zero. They were the last of the knights of the air, believing in the romantic notion of the single combatant. They viewed the dogfight as a test of personal honor. The Americans, armed with Thach's doctrine, stopped fighting for honor and started fighting for geometry. They stopped trying to be aces and started trying to be wingmen. The Weave killed the concept of the lone wolf. In the new American doctrine, a single plane was nothing a zero, but a section of two planes was a weapon system. This shift exposed the catastrophic flaw in the Japanese military philosophy. The Imperial Navy kept their aces on the front lines until they died, believing their spirit and skill were irreplaceable. They refused to rotate them home to train the next generation. In contrast, the U.S. Navy pulled men like Thach and Flatley out of the cockpit and sent them back to the training command. They took the secrets of the Weave and mass-produced them. Every rookie pilot coming out of Pensacola in late 1942 knew the Weave before he ever saw a Japanese plane. He didn't need to be a genius. He just needed to follow the steps. Turn, cross, clear the tail. The Weave industrialized the kill. It allowed a 20-year-old farm boy with 300 hours of flight time to survive against a Japanese samurai with 10 years of combat experience. By 1943, the technological tide began to turn. The Grumman F6F Hellcat arrived in the Pacific. The Hellcat was the answer to every prayer a Wildcat pilot ever whispered. It had a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine. It was faster than the Zero, could climb with it, and could dive away from it. But crucially, the tactics didn't change. When the Hellcats arrived, they didn't abandon the Weave. They supercharged it. With the Hellcat's performance, the Weave went from a defensive survival tactic to an offensive juggernaut. American pilots would deliberately drag Japanese fighters into the trap, using their superior speed to dictate the engagement. The Japanese pilots, still flying the lightweight Zero, which had barely been upgraded since Pearl Harbor, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. They were fighting a faster, tougher enemy that refused to fight one-on-one. The result was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in 1944, where U.S. Navy pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The lopsided score wasn't just about the plane, it was the legacy of the matchsticks. The Japanese were still flying, heroically, alone, while the Americans were flying as a synchronized, unbreakable grid. Thach had done more than invent a maneuver. He had proven that in modern warfare, the system beats the individual. The romantic era of the scarf-wearing aviator dueling in the clouds was dead, buried under the cold logic of cooperative vector analysis. The Japanese never adjusted. They died holding on to the stick of a plane that was designed for a war that no longer existed, killed by a tactic that had been engineered on a kitchen table to make them obsolete. The obsolescence of the enemy was the ultimate vindication for John Thach. But the Navy wasn't done with his brain. The man who solved the puzzle of the Zero spent the next 40 years solving problems that others deemed impossible. He rose to the rank of full admiral, commanding the chaotic skies over Korea, and later pioneering the hunter-killer tactics used to track Soviet nuclear submarines during the Cold War. In every command, his philosophy remained unchanged. Look at the geometry, ignore the dogma, and find the fatal flaw. But despite the 4 stars on his collar and the fleets at his command, his legacy always circled back to that kitchen table in San Diego. Today, if you walk through the hallowed halls of the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, you will see the titans of American aerospace history. You will see the F-14 Tomcat, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the Hellcats that swept the Pacific. But tucked away in a glass case, far less imposing than the aluminum giants surrounding it, sits a small, unassuming cardboard box. Inside are wooden matchsticks. To the casual tourist, they look like trash. But to the fighter pilots who earn their wings of gold just down the road, they are a religious artifact. Those shards of timber represent the moment the United States Navy learned that the most dangerous weapon in warfare isn't the plane, it's the pilot who refuses to accept the odds. John Thach passed away in 1981, but the Weave is immortal. Every modern fighter pilot, whether they are flying an F-35 or an F-22, still learns the geometry of mutual support. The speeds have changed, Mach 2 instead of 300 knots, and the guns have been replaced by beyond visual range missiles, but the principle is absolute. You never fight alone. You never give up the initiative. and you never let the manual tell you how to die. Thach proved that when you are outgunned, outnumbered, and outclassed, you don't need a miracle. You need to stop looking at the problem the way the enemy wants you to look at it. He took a terrifying reality, the superiority of the Zero, and twisted it until it became the enemy's undoing. But across the Pacific, while Thach was rewriting the book on defense, another American maverick was taking a blowtorch to the book on offense. He was a middle-aged, unauthorized genius named Paul Pappy Gunn, and he was staring at a B-25 Mitchell bomber with a maniacal look in his eye. The manual said the B-25 was a medium bomber designed to drop payloads from 10,000 feet. Pappy Gunn said it was a flying chainsaw. He was about to strap so many heavy cannons to its nose that the recoil would literally stop the plane in midair, turning a sluggish transport into the most terrifying commerce destroyer of the war. To see how Pappy Gunn built the strafing Mitchell and massacred the Japanese supply lines at the Bismarck Sea, you need to hit that subscribe button and verify your notification settings right now. The algorithms of YouTube are just like the Pacific, vast and easy to get lost in. Don't let these stories disappear. Like this video to help us break the suppression, and we'll see you in the next briefing.